Hi everyone, and welcome to part 2 of the Robotic Imaging from Chilescope series. I'll put the link to the first part somewhere here. It might be up there. I'm not exactly sure where it throws it on YouTube when I do this kind of thing. But it's not necessary that you watch the first video, although you might be curious of how we got to this point. This video is about processing all the data, and the sessions have finished and completed. I downloaded everything and I went through it and processed it. Now I'm going to go through the entire process and show you how I got from this to this. Yeah, I'm not going to tease you and make you wait till the very end before I show you the results. I mean, it's actually sitting right here on the back screen, although that's a bit blown out. But anyways, I guess let's just get started, right? Excellent. So I'm in here in PixInsight, and this is the screen. As you can see, there are 4 files open: Luminance, blue, red, and green. So I was pleasantly surprised to find out from the last video that there was a lot of non-astrophotographers that watched, just curious of how it's done. So a bit of a challenge for me at this point is, how deep do I go into the minutia of this is processed, or give some general oversight? I hope to find the right balance here, but I know one of the questions is, well, I don't understand. It's a monochrome camera. It's black and white. How do you get a color image from that? And as you see here on the screen, there's 4 images, 4 different data sets from 4 different filters, but they're all still black and white. I mean, you're probably expecting the blue to look like it's blue, and the red to look like it's red, and the green to look like it's green. Well, I think the best way to make you illustrate how this all comes together is to actually show you a camera and how it works. So give me 1 second. Let me grab my CCD camera that I use here in Toronto. Okay, I'm back. And this is it. This is a SBIG ST10 XME NABG camera. That flows off the tongue, doesn't it? This is actually 2 components. The camera portion is this other off-color black anodized aluminum bit. The front portion here is a filter wheel, and in here are all the filters. The camera is in here. It's in a sealed chamber. It's cooled to approximately 30 degrees below ambient temperature. The reason we cool these cameras is because it eliminates, or it reduces the amount of dark current. There's a certain type of noise that happens as the chip gets warmer and warmer. By cooling it, dark current comes down dramatically, dark current noise. This is just the nose piece that plugs into the back of the focuser on a telescope. And if we look inside it, you can see there's a filter in there. Behind that is the actual CCD chip. You know, let me just take the cover off. I'm going to show you. 1 second. Wait. There's 6 tiny little screws that remove the front cover. This is not made to actually come off on and off very easily. And once you put the filters in there, that's it. You don't really need to remove it. There aren't very many reasons why you need to do that. So almost done. Don't want to lose these little screws. Okay, and 1 more to go. Last screw. Okay, so now I should be able to remove the cover to the filter wheel. And off it comes, and ta-da! There it is. You see? Let me just put this down. And what we have here is a little wheel with, there's 5 filters in here. This is a little motor that spins that the filter wheel around, and from the software I can basically tell it, okay, I want to image in red, so it'll spin around the filter and find the red filter, which is this one here, that one there, and place it in front of the chamber. I'm going to remove the filter wheel completely. This comes out. Filter wheel in hand, and as you can see, let me just get my fingers out of the way, there's various different colored filters in here. There's blue, there's green, red, This one is clear. That one is actually the Luminance filter that doesn't really block anything. This is a special filter called a H-alpha filter. It isolates hydrogen emissions, and it's very good for imaging from the city. Anyways, that's basically what it is. If I show you the camera itself without the filter reel in, there is a little chamber. The shutter is closed. You can't see it, but the chip is behind there. The filter wheel spins around, positions each color filter in front of the chip, and then the light is filtered as it goes through. So this is not coloring the light that's going through. It's basically eliminating all the other bandwidth. So it only lets, this would only let red, green, or blue pass through. It still hits a monochrome chip, though. So it still comes out black and white. Let's look at this image here on the screen again. I mean, at first glance, it looks like, well, they all look identical. I mean, but you have to take a bit of a closer look. And let me give you an example here. So this is my red filter right down here. And let's look at the green filter in comparison right beside it. So like I said, it looks like it's the same thing, but in actual fact, let me just zoom it open. Look at this part here. This that I'm showing you here. On the red filter, that's what it looks like. Let's look at the green filter, the same area. And on the green filter, you see it's barely visible. You see? Back, let's compare it to the red filter again. Red, green. Red. You see this area here, there's a lot of red signal, but there's hardly any green signal. And if I look in Photoshop, the finished image, yes, spoiler alert, and you can see that part is mostly red. There's no green in it. This is what happens is now in the software is we're going to combine all these channels into a color image. All right, so let me just organize myself here a little bit more so it's clear to everyone what is actually going on. So yeah, basically now at this point, all the images are, all the various data sets have been combined, they have been calibrated, they've been registered. So they've all been aligned, so they're perfectly matched up. The next step is basically to combine those channels into a color image. So very simply, in PixInsight, there's a channel combination function or process dialog. So I will select the actual appropriate images for red, for green. Let's figure that one out. For blue, there we have it. And all I just have to say is go ahead and apply it, and it creates a new RGB image. I can't see anything yet, but I'm going to apply a screen transfer just so that we can make sense of it. Believe it or not, this is really what the data looks like when it comes off the chip. I mean, we're imaging blackness, and what the screen transfer function does is allow us to do a screen stretch in more layman's terms. What it increases the brightness and the gamma so that we could see it. Doesn't change the data, but it's just for a preview on the screen. So I'll press this button, and voila, we have a color image. Now, mind you, it's not balanced properly. It's overly green. So once we have it, you know, this was just basically combining the three different images onto three different planes into RGB without any regard to the actual proper balance between red, blue, and green. We can do that next with a color calibration tool. But before I actually do that, I need to crop off these extra areas around the edges here. And those are just residual leftover bits where when it went to register and stack them all up and then line them so all the stars lined up perfectly, that's the bits on the various combination of frames that didn't match up. So mostly red on this one side here, and you can see there's blue and green on this side here. So the easiest thing to do is just to crop it, and PixInsight makes this quite simple with the dynamic crop tool. And why the dynamic crop tool, actually I already have a process open here on the screen, is good is because it will let me apply that exact same crop to different frames. And this specifically, I'm going to have to do it to the Luminance frame as well. So I'm going to crop it like this. Sorry. And it's done. And at this point, I can do a much better color calibration with this kind of an image because there is no funky edges. So let's open up the color calibration tool. And let's just follow the exact image and throw it on here. Just see what it does with just the standard. Okay, so it did that, and let me, again, it improved it a little bit, but it's not great. So really I probably need to do a background modeling of it. If I just do simple ABE, actually I've already done it as you see before. There's a couple of ways of modeling the background in PixInsight. I'm not going to go through all the various specific methods because this is going to take forever if we did that. So instead, let me just do the ABE because that's just the simplest thing to do. Is it up here, my recently used? Of course not. So I will go and find it by background modelization. And I'm just going to use the automatic background extractor for now just because it's quick. And I will ask it to go ahead and apply it to this image. And it will come back with just the background. And let's take a look at the background. I'll stretch it a bit. And as you can see, well, yeah, that sort of matches up with the background, what you can see visually on this image. And the problem is, of course, is that this red stuff here at the bottom is legitimate. This green area here, well, that's a bias. That's just a green bias. So I have to work at this in order to not eliminate all this red stuff because that's legitimate H2 areas of this field. The green stuff has got to go though. So one of the ways of doing that as well is by I can actually subtract it, or I could adjust the color balance of it using a histogram. So if I grab this histogram and I point it to my RGB image, here's image 13. Sorry. If I scroll into this bit and just zoom into this area, and we can see that there's definitely a misbalance here between the three colors. So let's turn on the real-time preview and let's make a few adjustments. First, I want to lock the output histogram so I can see what's actually going on. And you know what? I'm going to apply the screen transfer function to this histogram. Let's do this. There we have it. And now I'm going to reset this, and look at this real-time preview here. So let's do some adjustments. Let's take a look at the green signal. And if I move the gamma and somewhere around there, let me zoom in a little bit more. Right around here. So already we can see is that it's substantially improved. That's just by changing the black point and the gamma point of the green signal. So let's just leave it at this for now. I've gone through a bunch of other tweaks in the meantime, and I'll show you the resulting image that I have. This is once I've done the background equalization and adjusted the color calibration. This is what I ended up with. I'm just going to kill this for now. I don't need it. Something like that. Okay, it looks a little bit washed out. I'm not too concerned about this at this point. As a matter of fact, this gives me a little bit more headroom, and I want it this way. So I have this RGB, and really I'm going to take this image into Photoshop. The other thing I need is the Luminance data, and I've got that separately as well. I've already pre-saved all of this stuff. But one of the things I want to show you is why I really like PixInsight. I mean, it's up to you how far you want to take a specific image. I get to a certain point and I say, okay, I'm ready for Photoshop now. I'm really familiar with it. I'm comfortable. I can move around there pretty quickly. So I'll take this image here, and before I bring it into Photoshop, there's some really cool things that PixInsight can do, like be able to enhance backgrounds. That's a multi-step process. It takes a lot of time by masking stars, reducing them, applying some multi-scale transforms. There's various techniques of doing it, but there's a very cool script that's come out fairly recently, I think, in PixInsight. And I go under the utilities, and it's called Background Enhance. So if I take this and I apply it against this image, I'll just do a quick little preview here so that you can see this. And it creates a couple of different images from that one RGB. Just let it finish. Okay, so it is showing me the original image is like that. The enhanced image, it just looks kind of hazy, but you can see that it actually has brought out some of the dimmer structures that are in and behind these stars here. But the cool thing about it is it does this. It shows me the actual background portion that it's extracted and thinks that there's some certain structures here. I could use this in Photoshop. The other thing it's done is created these small scale structures. In actual fact, this is not the parameters I want. I've already tried this before. Let me just run this through one more time. Okay, and ask it to do another preview. And I'll show you. The reason why I changed it to 4 layers is because now it basically will grab some of the broader, bigger ones and mask off the really smaller ones. And some of those other areas, it's not going to bother at all. So look at the small scale structures here, and you see what it's done is it's shown me this is what it considers small scale structures in the image. This is kind of a cool thing, because if I look at this, well, that looks like a star mask, a really detailed one. And I'm going to use that in Photoshop for various different reasons. But I look at the large scale structures, that's more like it. I mean, it's got some of the big nebula parts in here, but what I'm more concerned about is some of this little like dusty background, these nebulous areas. That's really interesting to me. The other thing it does is it creates a mask. So this mask I can also use in Photoshop to protect areas of the image that I don't want touched by the background enhanced functions. It shows me the original image and the enhanced image. So I'm just going to press OK, and it's going to spit out a bunch of images. And this is really useful to me at this point. The final image, I really don't need that because that's what it considers being enhanced, but I'm going to blend it myself in Photoshop. So I have a mask, I have the small scale structures, which I'm going to use as a mask, and I have this background information. Okay, armed with all this data, I am going to export everything as a 16-bit TIFF and open them up in Photoshop. So just give me a second here. Okay, I just wanted to point one thing out before I jump into Photoshop. One of the things that I like to do to determine if my color balance is in the ballpark is close is my barometer are stars. If I take a closer look and I zoom in to this area, even though it's not very saturated, I can definitely make out the hues of the stars. So I'm looking for a good distribution of blue stars, yellow stars, white stars, orange stars, and some, maybe even some red ones. If you get some brown dwarf stars in there, they'll show up as like a deep red. Like for example, this one right here where my cursor is in and around. There are no green stars, there are no pink stars, there are no purple stars. So if I see any of that, and then I know that my color balance is off. It's not right. This is the only thing that I use to judge whether I've got a good color balance or not. I don't look at deep sky objects because these can really deceive you in what it shows. So even though that I'm not using it, you can tell that I must be pretty close because these deep sky objects look good. They look like typical deep sky objects, which you'd normally see in this type of a emission plus reflection nebulosity. There's blue and there's red and things saturate and there's maybe some brown tones around on the dusties. So I'm pretty confident this is good, and I'm going to continue. At this point, let's go into Photoshop. And this is the finished image. Let me just zoom out here. The entire image with all the layers. And if I bring this up again, all my layers already assembled. So let me just turn everything off and start right from the beginning. How I started. So let's turn everything off here. That's off. Okay, the RGB. So I have my masters here in a folder, and I said I was going to export everything as a 16-bit TIFF, and that's what I have. So let's just open every one individually. I would start with the RGB. I'll open it in Photoshop. This is basically the color combined. You see it here, which is basically identical to the layer that I have in the background. So I'll take this, Control A, copy, or actually just start right from that point. So my very first layer is the base layer. This is the RGB image that I exported from PixInsight. Look at PixInsight. This is the RGB. Let me just zoom out to a normal scale. That's what it looks like in PixInsight, and this is what it looks like in Photoshop. They should be pretty much identical if you got the color spaces correct. So let's begin. The first thing I need to do, it looks a little bit hazy. I got to increase the contrast. Very simple curves adjustment layer, the classic type of S curve, which increases contrast. So let me open this up so you can see it. I'll remove these 2 points. So I will bring down this area, so that basically reduces the shadows, and bring this back up again, which increases the highlights. And so that's a basic type of a curve that I would normally do on this type of an image. And nothing too drastic. I'm just getting started, and I want to slowly move the image forward. Nothing radical at this point here. And I also want to make sure that every step of the way that I'm going, I'm not introducing any noise. Right now, this is a noise-free image. There's no noise reduction in here. I didn't do anything, apply any kind of noise reduction in PixInsight. And if I can avoid it, all the better. And there's probably, with this image, there's no reason why I would ever need to use any kind of noise reduction if I'm careful along the way and I don't do anything silly or just force it too much. If I move the needle forward just a little bit at a time, I should be able to get there without introducing any kind of noise. So that would be the first step. I'm just going to undo this because I've already done it a couple of times. Back to my open state. This is the simple contrast adjustment. Okay, the other thing I can do here is increase the saturation. I want to make these targets a little richer in color. So normally I'm just going to use the vibrance and saturation layer because this gives me, and you see what the difference is between turning it on and off. I use a combination of saturation and vibrance, and they work slightly differently. Vibrance is a bit more natural in that it will only saturate or increase the saturation of objects that already have color in them. So it's not going to take something that has very little color and increase the saturation, because that can make it look weird. Here, I'll show you what I mean. I'll just reset the vibrance to 0. And if I take the saturation and I crank it up, okay, so it's starting to look kind of unnatural. In order to get the amount of color that I want in some of the areas like these reds and it's done something a little bit weird to the blue. Some people might like this. I think this has gone too far. So that's the nice thing about the vibrance layer. I mean the vibrance adjustment. So if I'll turn this up, and we'll see that it actually does a really nice job of enhancing the saturation of the proper tones. I say the things that can take more saturation without it looking weird and off. At the same time, I do want to increase overall saturation just a tiny bit. So I find a happy medium, and I just play with this until it looks okay. And one thing that is a good practice is to walk away. So if I'm staring at this for a long time, it looks less and less saturated, and I want to continue to increase it and increase it the more I stare at it. So by walking away for a few minutes, coming back and reevaluating, then I think I have a better perspective on what's really happening on the screen and what looks good. So there we have some very basic adjustments. I increased the vibrance and I increased the contrast on the image. So standard, this is what came in. Two adjustment layers later. Say that 5 times fast. 2 adjustment layers later, and it's looking like this. So let's move on a little bit more. Okay, still not enough contrast for me. It still looks kind of hazy, but I don't. At this point, I'm going to say, there are alternate ways of increasing contrast without using a curves layer. One of my favorite ways is basically to take the image of itself and blend it with another light, a blend mode. So you see, I've already done it here, but I will show you my little technique. At this point, I have these 3 layers and I want to continue, but I need the image itself so it would be a destructive edit. I hate destructive edits. That's not me. So what I'm going to do is press Control-Shift-Alt-N-E. And what this does is basically creates a brand new layer as a copy of whatever is visible at that moment on the screen as a new layer. This layer here is identical. If I turn it off, there's no difference. So, but soft light, this is a really nice layer. And you see what's happened there? Everything has become really high contrast, too much so, but we're going to control this in a second. But also when you decrease the brightness of an image and you do this kind of thing, you see it becomes even more saturated. The colors are deeper. So one of the things that I like to do, let me just remove this because I've already have this layer up here, which is, I've already done it and I've worked on it. It's taking me a bit of time. I'll turn it on. Voila, you see what's happened there? I've basically used the blending mode adjustment and limited where that soft light, first off, I've decreased the saturation, the opacity down to 69%. But this part here down here, this is a really useful feature. And basically what it does is it limits the adjustment to only a tonal range within the image. If I crank this up, it's affecting the entire image. If I bring this down, it's saying, okay, from 0 to a specific point, make that adjustment. Don't do it globally. If I do it here, the entire image is done. I really only want the shadows to be affected by this additional contrast from the soft light layer. So I'm going to pick a point roughly around here. Then instead of having a sharp cutoff, I'm going to feather the transition from fully applying the effect to not applying an effect by pressing down the Alt key and opening this up a little bit. And I'm going to just keep adjusting it here until I get it to where approximately that's, whoops, let me just, I just close it up again. Maybe somewhere around here. That looks pretty good to me. And so before and after, and there's still a lot of brilliance in here, but I've taken the background and squished it back a bit, and now you can start to see some of the subtle changes. And like there's this red stuff here, there's some blue nebulosity behind here, and it would be really nice to enhance this, right? So how do I do that? Well, if you've peeked ahead and you've seen this layer, I already have a layer in here called a glow. But before I turn it on, I'm going to show you what I did. Remember back in PixInsight, we created this background enhancement. I've got this here. I can use that. I can use this to add it to the image to enhance some of this background flux that's there. So let's go ahead. Let's start that. Back in the RGB. If I look at my masters, I have the RGBBE, which is basically the layer that is called the background enhancement. Let's open it up. So here it is. Select all, copy, and I paste it into my main layer as this new glow layer. So I'll turn it on. Actually, I'm going to just eliminate the mask here. Turn this up to 100%. So see what it's done is it's basically made everything glow, but it's also blown out all these areas. Because if I look at this layer by itself, this is what it looks like. And because I've set the blend mode to linear dodge, which is basically adding, well, of course it's additive, and everything else underneath is going to be blown out. So all I really want is this subtle background stuff here, maybe some glow around the bigger parts of the brighter nebulosity, but I don't want the entire image to be like that. So I think one of the first things I need to do is basically modify this, increase the enhancement, so increase the differences in contrast between the various different subtle shades in here. So you can use a curves layer, and frankly, I like using this brightness contrast under legacy mode. It works really well, and it's a lot less hassle. For example, if I do this and I crank this up, you see that it's actually increasing the variation on this background area itself, which is good. That's what I want. So I have this. Let me turn everything back on, and you see what kind of a mess I've just created. But fear not, you can start to see and make out that there is some nice variation in textures and some depressions and brighter areas of the background. However, this is a big problem, having this all blown out. But remember, back in PixInsight, that cool little adjustment thing created this mask for me. I can use this mask to protect areas of the image that I don't want enhanced in that way. So again, my master's image, I open up the mask in Photoshop. And this is what it looks like. Control-Alt-Copy. But instead of adding it as a layer, what I've done in this situation is I've actually applied it as a glow mask. So if I did, so I'll paste, that's the mask in there, then I invert it, and then I can actually make a few adjustments to this, and I'm done. But let me just back up, because I did go through a few steps in order to keep refining this mask, and I'm not going to get into those details because, like I said, I can't turn this into a 2-hour video. Select canvas, there we go. We're back to the original mask. So when I turn this mask off, whoops, here it is. Let me turn the mask off and see what happens. Blown out. When I turn it on, well, it's protected. The other thing is now I've got to just, I don't want 100% of this. I had it, I believe, at 41%, which that seems to be okay for me. So off, on, and what's happened here? Well, yeah, everything has sort of become kind of dreamier, glowier, but there's still all the resolution that was there before. So you just got to be careful with it. You adjust to taste. I might bring this down just a little bit more, and it's becoming more interesting. There's more texture. This background flux that is actually there, hidden by the sea of stars, is now come out a little bit more prominently. Okay, so next step. We're making good progress here. Liking what's happening so far. The luminance layer, surprisingly, I really didn't use very much, because when I inspected everything, the resolution and the depth of the RGB were so good that I didn't feel it necessary to apply the entire luminance layer like this. Actually, I needed to add some contrast. That wasn't really doing anything for me. And it was unnecessary and required many more steps. But the one thing that's really good that I could really use this for is to use it for applying additional details and bringing out, squashing the contrast in some areas where there is more detail. So in this case, for example, there's this like ghost-like figure that has this face in here. Without it, with the luminosity mask, with the luminosity layer, just basically targeting certain areas. So in this case, that's one area that I'm targeting. If you don't know how a mask works, mask is basically just a way of, it's like masking tape, right? You're masking off different areas so when whatever effect you're applying or painting, that it is not affecting the areas that are masked off. And in a mask, the rule is quite simple. White reveals, black conceals. So anything that is white or any shade of white allows that portion of the image to come through. Anything that is black, that's the mask. That's the masking tape, basically. Think of it that way. That's the easiest way for me to think about it. So yeah, here we have basically added a little bit more tonal structure to that area, which I thought was important to do. I have a layer called Sharpen. In this case, I haven't had to use anything. I've just basically taken the exact image again. That same trick where I showed you before is Control Shift Alt N-E. It basically takes the sum of all the visible layers and creates a brand new layer. And on this one here, I'd like to increase some details. So one of my favorite ways of sharpening, and it depends on the object, there's different ways of doing it, is to use a Smart Sharpen filter. So under Sharpen, we go to Smart Sharpen. And the Smart Sharpen filter is almost a bit like a deconvolution. And for any astrophotographers that are familiar with the process, you've seen that so far I haven't applied any kind of sharpening at all from PixInsight. And normally I might try some deconvolution to move it, to sharpen up the image. But this one, I decided not to for numerous reasons. I'll get into in a little bit. But it'd be really nice to be able to grab some details out of the area. So instead of like picking, say, for example, 100% strength and finding a radius that kind of works, like maybe 4 pixels, 2, 3, 8 pixels, something like that. You can see that by before and after. Yeah, it does something. One of my favorite ways of using this is to go and select a radius that's sub-pixel, below 1 pixel. So 0.6, 0.7, 0.8, something like that. And then really crank up the amount. So before and after. And what you can see, it's almost like refocusing without... the cool thing about this is sometimes if the pixel radius is too big, it starts to look at larger structures, but there's very fine structures that get smoothed over. But by using a really small radius and turning up the amount to a ridiculously high number, it's almost as if doing multiple iterations of deconvolution. But that's not really what it's doing here, but the effect is similar. So I'll press OK, and we'll see what the difference is before and after. See, it's just like all of a sudden, oh my goodness, everything comes into focus, but it's not overly sharpened. Now, back areas here, this is all... It's sharpened up all this nice little noise that was completely invisible before. It's made all the stars crunchy and square, which that's destruction. The only thing I really wanted was to sharpen was this area right here. That's what I'm looking for. So this is where a mask comes in. Let me just throw this away because I already have that layer done. It's like those cooking shows, you know, where they show you how they prepare the ingredients and then they stick it in the oven and then a second tray comes out and it's that step is already completed. Sort of what I'm doing here. The mask, I'll turn it back on, and all it really is basically highlighting, just creating a mask, the areas where I want the sharpening applied and not applying it to anywhere else. There's only a few select areas, basically right in here. In this area, in the middle of, where else do I have this mask? Yes, this little blue part here. I like to add a little bit of sharpening to that as well. If I get rid of this mask, I'll show you how I create the mask. It's actually, it's very simple, but if I do it a couple more times, let me just delete it. Delete that mask and start again. So I'm going to create a mask. It's all white, basically saying there is nothing that's hidden. I'm going to invert this mask. Control I is a shortcut for doing that. And now let's start up here in this part of the nebula. And I'm going to use a brush. And I'm going to paint white on the mask. So if I start going over this area, it looks like I'm painting on the image, but I'm not, because you see here that the mask is highlighted. So I'm going to start selecting in there, and sure enough, oh, nice little details that start to show up, all these really fine little structures. Let me just back out a bit. With it, without, and there's actually a little bit of a difference in the luminosity, and there's a reason for that, but let's just do this area too. some structures. Now, one of the things that's happening as well is not only these structures are being enhanced, but see these tiny little stars, they're getting crunched up. So I'm just going to remove them from the sharpening. So I'm going to, instead of having the white, I'm going to reverse it to black to reveal, make my brush even smaller, and just blot out these little stars. There we go. They look a little bit more natural. I might do a few more. If I look at my mask, now see what I'm doing. I'm punching little holes in it, areas where I don't want it to be sharpened. Right, and there's, like, you can see ringing about certain areas, but I'm still highlighting and sharpening other structures in there. Same thing back up in this part of the nebula. There's all these tiny little stars that are kind of looking gross. And you know, you might be thinking, well, you know, you're zoomed in 300% here. Who's going to notice that? Well, it does. You do notice it, even if you're just viewing it at normal resolution. And I'm a stickler for these kind of details. I like to pixel peep because I find if I get in there, I see what's really going on, and I fix them, and it seems to improve the overall image. It comes off looking a little bit more professional and polished. So there's my mask, basically, for those two areas that I want sharpened. Okay, next thing is a minimum filter. Beautiful thing about this image is the fact that there are so many stars in it. PixInsight calculated it to be 76,000 stars or so, but it didn't pick up everything. So conservatively, 100,000, 120,000 stars wouldn't be unrealistic to estimate of what is being resolved in this image, which is great, except that, well, you know, you can't see the nebula for the stars. There are so many stars in here, sometimes it obliterates it. So it might be a good idea, actually, to apply a minimum filter, which is an erosion filter. So let's give that a try. Again, I already have a layer. You can see it here. It's off, but I'm gonna. I mean, I'll show you in a second. To actually create that minimum filter, I'm going to do my same trick. Control Shift Alt N E. Create that layer. Let's zoom in a bit and apply the minimum filter under Other, Minimum. And I'm going to give it something, I've already done this once, 0.4 pixels, preserve roundness. Press OK, and let's see what it does. Okay, well that's interesting. This minimum filter, if I just back off a bit, I'll turn it off and on. Here is with the minimum filter on, with it off, on. So a lot of those stars have receded into the background. They're still sort of there, but you see what's happened is the nebula is now popping out a bit more. It's easier to see. Sometimes all those stars can be distracting. So let's go have a closer look, see what actually it's done. Uh-oh. This doesn't look too good. You see all these little stringy little bits everywhere? That's an artifact of the minimum filter, because it's not just minimizing the stars, because I only want it to minimize stars. But it's actually grabbing everything in the background. If I turn that off, you see what I mean. Right? So some certain stars that are really close together, like if I look here, now it's turned them into these connected little lines. Not what I want. So how do I deal with this? Well, remember back in PixInsight we had that small scale star mask. I've already have it open somewhere. Remember this? From PixInsight? That looks like a perfect star mask. So Control Alt copy, see? And back in Photoshop, I've actually already created a layer with just a mask on it that I can reuse. And if I have a look at it, this is it. This is what came from PixInsight. So I'm going to reuse this. So back on my star mask, I mean my minimum filter layer, the one I'm just playing with now, a little tip, if you don't know, if you press Control and click on the mask, it turns the mask into a selection. And once I've done that, I can add a layer mask, and that selection becomes the actual mask itself. So here we go. And let's go look again now, Pixel Peep, and see what's happened. Before, after. Let me turn the mask on. Oh, there's our little stringy bits, and when I turn the mask on, the star mask, it's basically not touching all that little small structure stuff. And this is what I meant before when it counted the number of stars. PixInsight when it created this is what it counted. It counted 76,000 stars. But obviously there's more than that because the mask is not grabbing every single little star, as we can see from here. Right? There you have it. Okay. So that's our minimum filter. Let me just delete that and go back to the original one. I actually did apply the minimum filter. I modified the mask a little bit from just what it was. And what I did is I made certain areas dimmer where I didn't want the mask to apply, and certain areas brighter where I did want the mask to apply. And in the end, it's a subtle change, but it's enough for me. I can actually turn up the effect on this even more. It's a matter of personal preference how far you would like to go with that. But so let's just leave it at this. I'm going to back off a bit. I kind of like having a lot of stars in the field. But a little bit of reduction, a little bit of receding into the background is not a bad thing. Okay, so we're almost there. One thing that I noticed, remember I said stars, colors are my barometer. If I go in really close and start to pixel peep here, we see, oh, wait a second, these really dim stars here, they have a bit of a green tinge to them. I didn't take care of it fully in PixInsight. I actually did apply the SCNR tool, but I didn't want to go too far and ruin the balance of the rest of it. And I knew that later on I can fix some of this. In Photoshop, I'm going to do a little bit, but I'm going to save the rest of that for Lightroom because there are certain tools in there that make things a bit easier. So for getting rid of this, I basically just did a selection color range, and I've gone in, and I'm going to select none for a second here, and I'm going to pick those offensive green stars. Click my dropper tool on there, and whoops, make it a little bit fuzzier. Sampled colors. I'm going to add maybe a little bit more. Oh, too far. Undo. Okay. So that I have a mask, basically a color selection mask, which I have done on this layer here. So this has isolated those green stars. I worked at it for a little bit. Those little green dim stars. And for that one, I've basically, very simply, I've added a hue saturation adjustment layer. And I've just reduced the saturation down to like -100. I've changed the hue a little bit so that it becomes a little bit warmer out of the green range. But it's not like a drastic thing, but it's enough to make a difference. And, you know, to me, that's important. I know that it's there, and I know that I've taken care of it to a certain extent. One last thing is to look at the overall color balance and see, I mean, it looks pretty nice, yes? It looks pretty nice. But let's look at the histogram. And the histogram is showing me a slight misbalance. Not that you can trust this completely, but we see that there's more blue. There's some green picking out on this area here. So if I just use a simple color balance adjustment using levels, nothing too drastic here. It's a subtle change, but it realigns. See how it just realigns the histogram so they're a little bit more matched up. And there it goes from basically a slight blue bias to everything to a little bit more neutral. I don't know if you can notice that, but I see it, and to me that makes a bit of a difference. And all I've done is gone through each individual color and I adjusted them until the histograms look like they look a little bit more matched up. So on the green channel, I've had to adjust the gamma a little bit. And actually, you're not seeing the bottom parameters here. Let me turn that up. And on the blue channel, I've adjusted the gamma in the opposite direction and the output level a tiny bit as well. And that's enough for me at this point to say, I really like this image. This is looking really good. Any final tweaks, I'm going to do it in Lightroom, the polishing and the rest of it. So let's move over to Lightroom. Okay, so we're in Lightroom. And this is the image that I exported from Photoshop as a 16-bit TIFF, and I've made a few little tweaks to it. Let's look at the entire grid. I've taken it and I've basically created a bunch of different crops and framings of objects in there, maybe to get a better composition or what I think might look good for a presentation. But looking at the base image itself in the develop module, and I've done a few little tweaks. I increased the contrast a tiny little bit, not that anyone's going to notice too much. Sometimes as an imager, you stare at an image and you get tunnel vision and you keep looking at it and you think a tiny little adjustment is like big, and other people won't even notice it. They'll go, what? There's no difference. They're identical. And generally they're right. But, you know, I still got to do what I feel is right. The biggest changes I made here are to the HSL panel. And I've increased the set. So let me just go back in here. I've increased the saturation of red a little bit, orange and yellow by a lot. I've decreased the saturation to green to basically nothing. Aqua as well, which is like a teal kind of color, and I brought that back about halfway as well. They're really, this doesn't belong in this kind of a photo. And as you see, the background has now mostly that green, very dim green-gray type of dim star has disappeared. And what we're left with, especially in a field like this, you have these beautiful, rich jewel tones of those yellows and those reds and those oranges. And you have the brilliant blues and white stars. This is what I look for in this type of a photograph. This type of an image with this many stars is almost comparable to a globular cluster. There's so many stars in here, although not quite, because there's all that nebulosity. So nothing much else. I haven't done any noise reduction, as you've seen throughout the entire process. There's never been any kind of noise as an issue, and that's because, you know, I was really careful every step, reevaluated it. Now I got to tell you that it's taken me days to work through that image. What you see here, and we just went through it rather quickly, it's not because it took me 20 minutes to do it. I'm just retracing my steps, and I have all the layers there, but I agonized over every single little step. And the other thing that I do is I walk away from it, sleep on it overnight. I send it out to my peers that I trust, to give me some feedback and see if I'm missing something obvious, or, you know, get some constructive feedback. It's always good to be able to do that. If you have some people you can trust to bounce it off of, then I highly recommend that you do that. Don't be too rushed to get it out the door. Let it simmer for a few days. See how it sits with you. This is my second attempt at it. The first attempt wasn't so good. Let me show you. Okay, here it is. And interesting, but this is really forced, really overdone. You know, the backgrounds, there's like these really heavily saturated blues. The yellows aren't quite right. The blues have some green in it. The yellows have some green in it. And it looks forced. It's just overdone. And that's because I made some mistakes early on with color balance and the calibration, and I thought I could fix it later. And as I kept moving into the image more and more, my problems got worse. You know, it's one of those things where a little mistake that you make near the beginning, or a misjudgment, will cause you tons of grief, a big shift in the way the image is going later on. It's like that butterfly on the other side of the world that flaps its wings, and all of a sudden there's, 2 weeks later, a hurricane happens in the Atlantic. I mean, I'm exaggerating, but that's generally what happens with this kind of stuff. So when I got to this point, I said, no good, let me start again and just take my time. And I've already learned from my mistakes of going through it once. Second time should be better. And what you see here, this is my second attempt. And let me go full screen so you can see it and zoom out. It's trying to get the preview resolution. So that's basically it. The only other thing that I did was played with certain crops on the image. So for example, I thought that was a nice composition. This kind of looks cool. Another look at it with just one of the main objects. I think this is NGC 2025, the Dragon's Head Nebula. This is just the river of blue stars that looks pretty. It's just a pretty composition to my eyes, at least. the little wormhole in this structure, the bottom part of the image, just recropped. Just, I mean, I'm just playing and experimenting, see what I like and what I don't like. And there we have it. This one's in the bag. It's done. I guess maybe I should talk a little bit about the cost of this. You'd be surprised. Well, I don't know if you'd be surprised or not, but, you know, I come from doing remote imaging for a long time, so I'm pretty... I don't get sticker shock that easily. This image is about $180 to do, which is, in my opinion, a pretty good deal in the end of it, considering what you get from it. The reason why it came out so cheap is because if you noticed in the video number 1 where I was planning it, I was actually in the last quarter full moon phase where the majority of these light frames were shot. And even though I was in the last quarter full moon, the moon never rose above the horizon. It was always below the horizon while I was shooting all of this. But the nice thing about Chilescope is that if you do shoot during other moon phases other than new moon, you get a discount. Quarter moon, it's about 35%. I don't remember what it is for a half moon or three-quarter moon, but, you know, it goes up from that point. So if you can get away with shooting during times that is not a new moon, you can save a considerable amount of money. So the way it works at Chilescope is that you buy points, and every telescope is worth X number of points per hour. The telescope that I used here is 60 points an hour at new moon, and it's discounted at that point on and on. And they also give you certain discounts, a few points here and there, if they don't think that the quality, the sharpness is exactly perfect. Although, you know, I think I've received 7 or 15 points of discount for image quality. I frankly haven't noticed the difference at all, to be honest with you. So in all, it's about 180 points that I spent on this, which is $180 US. I guess you have to make your own judge of whether that's value or not. For me, though, it definitely is a bargain, considering you're not paying for any of the capital expenses of buying the gear. If you were to buy that gear, the telescope, the camera, the mount, the filters, the guider, the off-axis guider, all the other little bits and pieces that make it work, not including the infrastructure, the dome, all that automation and the software and the rest of it. I mean, it's at least 100,000 plus there in just the cost of the equipment. And, you know, I mean, you get what you pay for, I suppose, but it is quite a bargain, I can tell you that much. Like, even when I image here from Toronto, the gear that I use, that camera that you saw there, that was a fairly expensive camera when it came out. I mean, you know, $6,000 or $7,000 at least at that time. The telescope and the mount and just everything else, and then the skies. I mean, you can't buy, you know, I couldn't buy an accessory to fix the skies here in Toronto. So anyways, there you have it. I'm really happy with the way it turned out. I can't wait to do my second target at Chilescope. The summer Milky Way, for us up here in the northern hemisphere, is the summer Milky Way. For them in the southern hemisphere, that's the winter Milky Way, is getting up into position. There's some really beautiful things up there. And I'll pick something, take my time before I decide on the next target, and it should be a lot of fun. Anyways, I hope you enjoyed this series. If you have any comments, please leave them below. Any of the process I did, I hope I struck a good balance between technical and just general information so that everybody gets something out of it. Whether you're an experienced astrophotographer or a DSLR shooter that's looking into doing some deep sky, or just curious in general on how this all comes together. Let me know in the comments what you think. Please hit the like button if you enjoyed it. If you didn't enjoy it, hit this like button. It's the only way I'm going to learn. And subscribe, and I will see you next time.